Texas, 1884. Silverthorn, spring red earth, white limestone, and her father 5 days in the ground. 6 armed men had Rose Callahan surrounded. The man out front smiled slow, like he already knew how this ended. Vale owns this land now, girl. Smart people know when to walk away. Rose didn't move. Her hand stayed on the Winchester. Her voice came out flat and clean as Riverstone. The name on that deed is mine. Nobody changes that. Vale's gunman started reaching for his hip, then hoofbeats off the east ridge. Slow, unhurried. The pace of a man who had no reason to rush. The stranger looked at all 6 of them the way a man looks at a problem he's already solved. West Texas drawl easy and low. She doesn't look like she wants this conversation. Might be it's done. The gunman looked up. Looked again. His hand drifted back from his hip. Name, Ethan Cole, 2 words. The gunman went very still, the particular stillness of a man whose math just came out wrong. 6 men thought the cowboy was nobody. They were wrong about that in ways they couldn't afford. The full story starts right below, and it's one you won't see coming. 3 horses. That's what she heard first. Not the dust cloud, not the creak of saddle leather. 3 horses moving at a walking pace on the north road. Steady, unhurried, the pace of men who knew they didn't need to hurry. Rose Callahan's hand was on the rifle before she turned around. Her father had taught her that. Hear first, look second, hand ready always. He'd taught her everything she knew about this land, how to read weather and water, and the kind of men who rode at a walk when most men would be pushing their horses hard. He'd taught her that a man in a hurry is afraid. A man who walks his horse is not. He'd been in the ground 5 days. She did not step back from the spring. Silverthorn Spring came up cold and clear through a crack in the limestone, pooled in a smooth white basin, then ran east along a shallow cut in the red earth. It was the only water for 70 miles in any direction that didn't go dry by August. Her father had found it in 1861, built everything from it. The house, the fences, 23 years of his life on this land. The graves were under the old cottonwood. Her mother first, 8 years ago. Her father 5 days ago. The earth on his was still dark. She stood between the spring and the riders and watched them come off the ridge. She recognized Wade Beaumont first. The gray hat, the wide shoulders. He'd known her since she was a girl. He'd put his hand on hers at the burial and said he was sorry. She'd believed him then. She wasn't sure now. The man on Beaumont's left was a stranger. He sat his horse like someone who'd spent good money learning how to sit still in difficult places. His right hand rested near his hip. His eyes moved across the property slowly, mapping exits, noting cover. She knew that look. The third man hung back, Byron Vale. She knew his name from the letter her father had thrown in the stove 3 months ago. He wore a dark suit, clean, not a speck of road dust on it. 8 miles out from town on a dirt road. That told her everything she needed to know. Beaumont pulled up about 15 feet out. Took his hat off, Miss Callahan. Sorry to come unannounced. No, you're not, Rose said. He put his hat back on. Vale edged his horse forward. He had a pleasant face. The kind of face that had spent years learning how to stay pleasant on purpose. Miss Callahan. His voice was smooth and even. I'll be straight with you, out of respect for your situation. The territorial court has issued a preliminary finding on the water rights matter. The original 1,861 survey contained an error. The spring technically falls outside the acreage your father legally filed on. Rose looked at him. I have read the deed to this property 200 times since I was 8 years old, she said. The name on that deed is Patrick Callahan, under Texas inheritance law. That name belongs to me now. Nothing in that deed specifies it has to belong to a man. Vale smiled a little. Courts tend to interpret these matters with flexibility in complicated cases. Courts interpret evidence, Rose said. Mine predates whatever you're holding by 23 years. Nobody said anything. Rose said it the way her father would have said it. Flat, clear, without drama. Because it didn't need any. You had my father killed. Vale's expression moved only slightly. a small adjustment around the eyes, like a man shifting his weight while trying not to show it. That is a very serious accusation, he said. I know what it is, Rose said, and you know it's true. So let's stop pretending this is a legal visit. She felt the fourth presence before she saw him. Not a sound exactly. A shift in the air. The kind that happens when something large moves at the edge of your vision. She heard Beaumont turn sharply in his saddle. Heard the man on the left go very still, in the way of someone who has already started running numbers. The rider came down off the east ridge on a dun horse, moving quietly for a big animal. He stopped about 50 yards out, off to the side, at an angle where he could see all three men, and nobody had his back. He was somewhere around 30, lean, weathered the way a man gets from working in the sun for a long time. Plain duster, a hat with a center crease, no badge, no markings of any kind. He looked at the three riders the way you look at a problem you've seen before. Didn't know there was a conversation happening, he said, West Texas cadence, slow and easy. She doesn't look like she wants to continue it. Might be the conversation's done. The man on Beaumont's left looked at the newcomer. Looked again. His hand drifted back from his hip. Name, he said. Ethan Cole. 2 words. The man on the left went very still in the particular way of someone whose math has just come out wrong. Vale looked at Danner. Danner looked at Vale. Something passed between them that had nothing to do with Rose. We'll be back, Miss Callahan, Vale said. I know, Rose said. I'll be here. They rode north. She watched them until the dust settled back into the earth, and the road was empty and quiet again. Then she sat down on the flat rock beside the spring. For the first time in 5 days, she didn't do a single thing. The stranger dismounted, walked his horse to the far edge of the pool to drink, didn't look at her. After a while, she said, without turning around, "You eat yet?" "No," he said. "Then come in." She stood and dusted her hands on her trousers. "I don't cook well. That was my father." He watched her walk toward the house. He tied his horse to the post and followed her. Not because she'd exactly invited him, because it was the right thing to do. Sometimes that's the only reason a person needs. Rose came downstairs at first light and found him already up. He'd boiled water. That was the first thing she noticed. The second was that he'd set out 2 cups, one with coffee, one with tea. Both ready, both waiting at the edge of the table where she'd reach them. He was standing at the window, looking at the north ridge. He didn't explain the 2 cups, didn't say anything at all. She looked at them for a moment. Then she took the coffee. He was a man who prepared for what he didn't know. That told her something worth knowing. Diego Reyes came in from the barn an hour later. He was 29 years old and had been working Callahan's Ridge since he was 16. He'd known Rose's father longer than some men know their own fathers. He set his rifle on the table within reach and sat down without being asked. That was Diego. He didn't need to be told where he belonged. After breakfast, Rose brought out the journal. It was a plain thing, brown leather cover, worn at the corners. 38 pages of her father's handwriting inside. Black ink on paper that had gone yellow from the Texas summer. He started writing in April, she said, 8 weeks before he died. Every evening after supper, she opened it and began to read. Ethan sat across from her and listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't ask questions. His eyes stayed on the dark window, but she could tell he wasn't looking at anything out there. He was listening the way a man listens when he's building something in his head. What the journal said was this. Vale had done the same thing before. Not just once. 3 times before Callahan's Ridge. Different properties. Same sequence. First, the fences get cut. Then the cattle get sick. Then a man in a good suit shows up with legal paperwork. 2 families had sold. Sold for less than the land was worth and moved on because they were tired and scared and couldn't see another way out. The Reyes family hadn't sold. Vale had taken their land through document fraud. Changed a date here, swapped a name there. And by the time Tomas Reyes understood what had happened, the deed was in someone else's name and the courts weren't interested. Diego listened to that part without moving. His jaw was tight. He didn't say anything. Nora Hayes hadn't sold either. She'd gone to the court and filed a proper petition with all the right paperwork. They denied it and sent her home. Her petition was valid. The law was on her side. The court looked at who was standing in front of them and decided the law didn't apply the same way. Patrick Callahan had written it all down. Every name, every date, every detail he could get his hands on. He had understood exactly what was coming. He had not told Rose. He thought he was protecting her. She stopped in the middle of page 24. She read the entry again. Then she set the journal on the table. "Harold Briggs," she said. Ethan looked at her. "The man at the general store," she said. "He's been telling Vale when we filed documents, where we keep the deed, what correspondence we sent, and when." She smoothed the page with her palm. "My father wrote it in March. Vale holds the note on Briggs's building. Briggs doesn't think of himself as an informant. He thinks of himself as a man out of options." Ethan said nothing. "My father wrote that those aren't the same thing," Rose said. "But they feel the same from the inside." She turned to the last page. The handwriting was different there. The letters were formed carefully, the same as always, but there was a slight tremor in them, a weight the earlier pages didn't have, like a man who was tired, but still working. She read it aloud. "Rose will know how to read the signs. I taught her enough. I hope I taught her enough." She closed the journal. She didn't cry. She'd spent 4 days crying and had run dry somewhere around Tuesday. She just sat with her hands flat on the cover. Diego said quietly, "He trusted you. That's what he put down there." She nodded. After a while, she asked Ethan why his name had made Danner think twice. She'd seen the look on Danner's face. She wanted to understand it. Ethan looked at his coffee. He turned the cup once in his hands. "I had a ranch," he said, "New Mexico. 6 years ago. Good water, good land, good location. Man named Conrad Shaw decided he wanted it for the railroad corridor coming through. Shaw and Vale are cousins. Different state, same playbook. You lost the ranch," she said. "I lost everything," he said. He said it in a flat, careful way. The way a person talks about something, when they've had to learn how to say it without falling into it. "The ranch first, then my wife, Eleanor. She grieved herself sick after we lost the land. I was trying to fight the legal case, and I didn't see how bad it was getting until I'd waited too long. She got sick that winter, and I couldn't." He stopped. "I didn't get there in time." Rose didn't fill the silence with anything. She'd learned that some silences needed to breathe. After a moment, she said, not looking at him, "You know what the worst part of losing someone isn't. It's not the pain itself. It's that people keep asking if you're all right, and you have to say you are, because they're not really asking. They're just hoping the answer is yes, so they can stop worrying." Ethan didn't say anything, but something shifted in him. She could see it, just barely, like a door that had been shut a long time, moving half an inch off the frame. "I've been following Vale's trail for 2 years," he said eventually. "That's part of why I'm here. But also," he paused, "I thought maybe this time I could do what I didn't do 6 years ago. Save somebody else's land," she said. "Save the person holding it," he said. Quiet, not dramatic, just the truth. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked away. Diego told them about his uncle Tomas then, how the land was taken, how the paperwork was changed and the courts wouldn't look at it fairly, how Tomas was living now in a 2-room shack 3 miles from the land he'd built. Ethan listened to all of it. Then he looked at Diego directly, not past him, not through Rose, at him. "You staying here because of loyalty," he said, "or because you want to see Vale answer for it?" Diego didn't hesitate. "Both." "Good," Ethan said. "Then we've got 3 reasons to win. Yours, mine, and hers." Diego looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded. That was how the alliance was made. No ceremony, no speech. Just 3 people at a kitchen table who understood that what they wanted was the same thing. They talked until midnight and came out with a plan in 2 parts. The first part was legal. Get Patrick's journal to a federal marshal named James Thorne, who was building a case against Vale from the railroad corruption side, not through the local telegraph, not through anyone Vale might be watching. A courier Thorne trusted on a back road, traveling light. The second part was defensive. Patrick had left something under the cellar floorboards, a hand-drawn map of the property with approach lines marked in red ink. Beside it, 6 boxes of rifle ammunition, a coil of heavy wire, and a set of iron stakes. He'd put them there months ago. He had known this was coming. He had prepared for it. He just hadn't told his daughter because he was her father, and he was trying to keep the fear from her for as long as he could. Rose held the map for a long time without saying anything. He knew, she said. He prepared for you, Ethan said, the best way he knew how. She put the map on the table and smoothed the edges down. Then she stood up and said they should sleep while they could, and went upstairs. An hour before full dark, Ethan walked out to the cottonwood alone. Rose was in the house. Diego was in the barn. He stood at the new grave for a while. The earth was still soft. Nobody had thought to put a marker up yet. He stood there long enough that the coyotes started up on the south flat. Then he said, quietly enough that only the ground could hear it, "I came late. I'm sorry for that." He went back to the house and took the first watch. Nobody asked him to. He just did it. That's who he was. Redstone had one church, one clinic with no doctor, one school that stopped at 4th grade, and one feed mill that Vale had bought in February. 340 people lived there, and most of them had learned by spring that the safest thing to do was keep your head down and your opinions to yourself. Rose rode in the next morning for supplies. Ethan followed at a distance, not because she needed watching over, because 2 sets of eyes cost nothing, and sometimes they catch what one set misses. She noticed it first at the post office. It was a sheet of paper nailed to the board out front. Had been there 6 months, by the look of it. The edges were curling from the heat. Nobody had touched it. Good land at fair price. Contact Continental Resources. It was advertising land that had belonged to a family named Sutter. Rose remembered the Sutters. They'd been quiet people. Corn and cattle. 3 kids. One night last fall, their wagon was loaded, and by morning they were gone. Their deed turned up in Vale's office 2 weeks later. Sold for 1/3 of what the land was worth. Rose stopped her horse. Read the paper. Got down. Took it off the board. Folded it twice and put it in her coat pocket. Agnes Whitfield crossed the street from the other side. She'd been watching. "You just did what this whole town has been afraid to do for 6 months," Agnes said. "It's a piece of paper," Rose said. "It's not the paper they're afraid of," Agnes said. "It's what taking it down means." Agnes was 59 years old and had the look of a woman who had done hard work her whole life without complaining about it. She'd known Patrick Callahan before Rose was born. She'd also organized women's suffrage meetings in Ohio back when that could get you looked at sideways by people who considered themselves respectable. She'd followed her husband, Carl West, and built a life here, and stayed anyway. After Carl made it clear, he thought she involved herself in too much. She involved herself anyway. That cost her something small every day. They walked together to the general store. Inside, Harold Briggs found something very interesting to do at the back of the counter. 2 women shopping for dry goods discovered that the bolts of fabric on the far wall needed close examination. A man pricing nails by the window stepped back slightly, so his hat was between him and Rose. Nobody said a word. Nobody needed to. Rose bought what she came for. Set her money on the counter. Briggs rang it up without meeting her eyes. She let him avoid her gaze. She knew what her father had written about him. She knew why he was looking the other direction. Outside, she and Agnes stood in the sun. "They're not bad people," Agnes said. She wasn't making excuses, just telling the truth of it. "They're scared people." "What does scared make a person?" Rose asked. Agnes thought about it honestly before she answered. "A bystander. Bystanders are still present," Rose said, "at whatever happens. Silence is a choice. It's just the most comfortable one to make." Agnes looked at her for a moment. "I used to think different. I spent some years thinking that quiet was the same as neutral." She watched a man cross the street on the far side, deliberately going wide of them. "Now I think you're right." They walked on. Outside the sheriff's office, a cluster of Vale's hired men stood in the morning shade. Rose counted them without looking like she was counting. 5 of them visible. She was looking for something specific. She found it. One of them was young, 17 at the outside, maybe younger. His face hadn't finished deciding what it wanted to look like. He neared his hand the way somebody does when they've been told to keep it there and aren't sure how it's supposed to feel. He was playing a role he didn't know the lines to. when Vale came out of the sheriff's office, and the men fell in around him. The young one followed last. He didn't look at anyone on the street as he passed. Not from arrogance, from something else. Shame looked a particular way on a person. Rose had learned to recognize it. She filed his face. Agnes took her 3 miles out of town on the south road to a property that sat 80 acres wide, well fenced, tended with the kind of careful attention that makes a place look like someone has been arguing against neglect for years and winning. The fence posts were freshly reset. The garden rows were straight as a surveyor's line. The small house was better kept than anything in Redstone proper. Nora Hayes came to the door. She was a black freedwoman, widowed 8 months ago, homesteaded under the Southern Homestead Act of 1866. Her deed was legal. Her taxes were paid through the current year. She'd filed a proper petition when Vale's men started moving on the north edge of her property. The court had sent it back. She stood in the doorway. Not rudeness, caution so old it had become habit. Rose told her who she was and what she was trying to do. Nora listened without interrupting. Then she said, "The court said I wasn't qualified to bring a petition." "On what grounds?" Rose asked. "On the grounds of what they saw when I walked through the door," Nora said. "Not what I had in my hand." Rose looked at her directly. "That's wrong. Not just because you were hurt by it, because nobody should be turned away from a court of law based on how they look. Law is written to protect every person. When it only protects some people, it stops being law. It becomes privilege with an official seal on it." Nora looked at her the way someone looks when they've heard people say the right things before and are waiting to find where the limit is. She opened the door a little wider. Rose went to the church after that. Pastor Elijah Greer was 56 years old, educated, and indebted to Vale for the new roof on the building he'd needed replaced for 3 years before Vale paid for it. He'd been telling himself for 14 months that this was a business arrangement and not a moral compromise. He knew that wasn't true. He knew it every time he sat down at his desk. Rose didn't mention Vale. She only asked if Greer knew what had happened to Tomas Reyes's original deed document after the transfer was filed. Greer knew. He folded his hands on the desk. Rose said, "My father trusted you enough to talk about the things that mattered to him. Pastor, do you know what he believed about people who know the right thing and choose quiet instead?" "He never said it to me directly," Greer said. "He didn't have to say it." Rose said, "He lived it every day." She left him with that. Across the street in the saloon, Ethan stood at the window with a cup of coffee and watched Rose move through the town. He'd been there an hour, staying back, watching the street the way a man does when he's trying to understand the shape of a place. He watched how people moved around her, how the space in the sidewalk widened slightly when she passed, how nobody stopped her, but nobody stood with her either, how she carried all of it without changing her stride. He recognized something in her that he hadn't seen in a long time, not in other people, not in himself for going on 6 years. It wasn't toughness exactly. Toughness was just not feeling things. This was something else. She felt everything and kept moving anyway. He drank his coffee and watched her and didn't name it yet, because naming it would have been getting ahead of himself. But he noticed it. That was the beginning. 2 in the morning. The ranch sat dark and still. Rose was in the cellar with her father's Winchester and her back against the stone wall. Her father had cut a low opening in that wall years ago. He'd told her it was for air circulation. She'd believed him at the time. Now she was sitting in front of it with a clear sight line to the east approach and understanding him a little better. He'd known. He'd always known it might come to this. He just refused to say it out loud. Diego was on the west side of the property behind the equipment shed. Ethan was on the north road, tucked in behind the water trough at the fence line. Rose breathed through her nose, slow and even. She could smell the dry grass and the cool stone and her own sweat. The night was loud at first. Crickets, a far-off coyote. The regular movement of horses in the corral. Then it went quiet. All of it. All at once. She'd grown up in open country. She knew what that silence meant. Something had moved into the night that didn't belong there. From the north, she heard 2 low whistles. Ethan's signal, one whistle back from the west. Diego. Confirming. Rose pressed herself against the wall and brought the rifle up. She counted to 60. Then she counted again. On the west, 3 horses hit the wire line simultaneously. The first horse went back hard. The second piled into it. A man went down in the dark and hit the ground with the particular sound of a person who wasn't expecting to land that fast. Then the cursing started. Loud, sharp, and bad for their situation. So much for quiet. On the north road, Ethan fired once. Right shoulder of the lead rider. She knew it was the shoulder because of how the man went and where the sound came from. She knew it was once because Ethan didn't fire twice when once was enough. He'd made that decision before the night started. No killing unless there was no other choice. She knew that because they'd talked through every decision before dark. 3 more horses tangled in the second wire, run on the west. A voice carrying through the dark. Go back. There's wire across rows fired through the loophole. High. 6 inches above the highest hat out there. Placed exactly where she intended it to go. It said, I can see you, I can hit you. I am choosing not to. The west side went quiet. From the north road, a voice. Clipped and controlled. Danner, pull back. Now Rose stayed where she was. She heard them pulling back. Horses, boots on hard earth, men moving fast and not talking anymore. Danner's men knew how to follow an order. She was counting to 60 again when she heard the sound from the east. Not gunfire, a scramble, someone losing their footing. Then a grunt and something hitting the wall of the equipment shed. She heard it wrong at first. Thought it was one of Vale's men. Then she heard Diego's breathing. She came out of the cellar low and fast and came around the east wall and found him against the stone with his back up and his left arm held tight against his ribs. He had his rifle in his right hand and he was still trying to bring it up. Stop, she said. There's still Danner called them back. She said stop. He stopped. She could see the arm in the dark. Not good. She stripped a length off the bottom of her shirt and got her hands on him. He didn't make a sound while she worked. He pressed his lips together and held still and let her do it. When she pulled the knot tight, he said, You're out of your mind. You'd have bled out in the dark while I sat in the cellar, she said, still working the ends of the cloth. Who's losing their mind? He almost smiled. Almost. She stayed beside him until she was sure the bleeding was slowing. His face in the dark had that particular stillness right after an injury, when the body is still catching up to what just happened. 2 full seconds of shock before the pain arrived properly. She waited. I can stand, he said. I know you can, she said. Do it slow. She helped him into the house. She was coming back through the barn door when she nearly walked into him. He was 17 years old, and he was sitting on the ground behind the water trough on the east side of the barn with his gun still holstered and his hands over his face. She stopped. She looked at him for a moment. Then she crouched down in front of him, not standing over him, down at his level. You didn't hit anyone, she said. He said nothing. I watched your shots, she said. Every one of them went high. 3, 4 feet over anybody's head. That wasn't bad shooting. She waited. So why? A long pause. I don't want to be here, he said. My father owes Mr. Vale $200. Vale said if I worked this job, he'd clear the debt. She looked at him. Young face, hands still shaking. He was a child wearing an adult's costume, and he knew it, and he was terrified someone would say it out loud. She said it out loud. A man who uses your father's debt to put a 17-year-old in the middle of a gunfight at 2 in the morning is not a creditor, she said. He is using you as a tool. Your father owes Vale money. That is true, but you do not owe Vale your body and your future. You never did. That debt was never yours to pay this way. He looked at her like that was a thing he'd half known and never heard said before. She let it sit. You're staying here tonight, she said. The door on the barn stays open. I'm not locking you in. In the morning, we'll talk. She stood up and went back to the house. At dawn, Ethan and Rose stood at the east wall and watched the sky go from black to gray to the color of old tin. Diego was inside. The arm was clean and bandaged, and he was asleep in the chair by the stove. Billy Crane was in the barn. The door was open, like she'd said. They'll come back. Ethan said. Not tonight, she said. No, not tonight. A red-tailed hawk made one long arc over the south pasture, looking for something in the new light. You did well, Ethan said. Rose turned to look at him. Not me, we did well. That's a different thing. He nodded slowly. He understood the difference. He didn't say so out loud, but she could see it in the way he absorbed it, the way a person does when something lands true. The spring ran at the bottom of the slope. Same sound it made every morning. Same sound it had made the morning. Her father was alive, and the morning after he wasn't. It just ran constant and clean and entirely indifferent to what the night had cost them. That was enough. Billy Crane sat at the kitchen table with both hands around a tin mug of hot water and told them everything he knew. He was 17 years old, and he'd spent the past 2 weeks trying not to know any of it. But he'd been present for things. He'd been in rooms where people talked, and the night before, crouched behind a water trough with his gun in its holster and his shots going deliberately high. He'd made a decision. He was done pretending he hadn't heard what he'd heard. So he talked. Rose sat across from him. Ethan was to her right. Diego stood at the kitchen doorway with his bandaged arm held close to his ribs. None of them were interrogators. They were just people listening. Vale had moved on 5 properties in the past 2 years. 5, not 3, like Patrick's journal said, because Patrick hadn't known about the 5th one yet. All of them had water or land along the railroad corridor. That's what connected them. That's what made them worth taking. 2 families had sold below value. Below what was fair, but they'd been squeezed long enough that getting something felt better than fighting for everything. One family had packed their wagon and left one night after their barn caught fire. The fire had been ruled accidental by a deputy who received $200 from a Continental Resources sub-account 11 days later. Billy had seen the ledger entry. Tomas Reyes's land had been taken through paperwork, changed dates, and swapped signatures and a deed that appeared in Vale's possession before Tomas understood what was happening. Nora Hayes's court petition had been denied. Diego went very still when Billy got to Tomas. He didn't say anything, just went still in the way that a man goes still when something he's carried for a long time is being spoken out loud by someone else. Ethan reached over and put his hand on Diego's shoulder. One hand, 1 second, nothing was said. That was enough. That was exactly enough. A man can offer comfort to another man without making a production of it. A hand is sometimes all the words there are. Before Rose and Ethan left to visit the people Billy had named, Diego and Billy were left at the ranch together. Diego didn't trust him. He made no effort to hide it. He moved through the kitchen and the yard, with his back to Billy, as much as possible, and his answers short when Billy spoke. Billy didn't argue, didn't explain himself or make promises. He understood that he hadn't earned anything yet. Understanding, that was the beginning of earning it. Rose had written to the Henderson family 2 weeks before any of this started. They'd been the second family to sell. She'd sent the letter to their new address in the next county, asking if they'd be willing to speak to a federal marshal about what happened. Their reply was waiting at the post office in Claxton, 8 miles south, where Vale didn't have a man watching the counter. She read it on the road. Ethan waited beside her. She folded the letter and put it in her coat. They said, no, she said. They have a life now. New place. New start. They don't want to go back into it. That's their right, Ethan said. I know it is. She looked at the road ahead. I was thinking about what justice means when the people who were hurt the most don't want to open it back up. What do you think? The horses walked. The flat land went by slow and gold in the morning light. I think it still matters, she said, because it's not only about them. It's about whoever Vale hasn't gone after yet. She paused. But I don't get to tell someone else what their healing should look like. That's theirs to decide. Ethan nodded once. She'd figured that out on her own. She hadn't needed him to explain it to her. He was learning. That was usually how it went with her. Tomas Reyes lived 3 miles east of his old property in a 2-room structure that had been intended as a temporary arrangement and had become permanent through the slow defeat of hoping otherwise. He was 60 years old. He had the eyes of a man who has had his hope taken from him enough times that growing more of it felt like a bad investment. When Rose told him she was building a federal case and that his situation was part of it, he looked at her with the patience of someone waiting to find the catch. "I'm not promising you a result," she said. "I'm promising that your name will be in the federal record, that what happened to you will be acknowledged as wrong in writing, with signatures. Whatever the court decides after that, the record will say it happened." He studied her face for a while. "You mean that?" he said. "Yes." He shook her hand. That was all. That was everything. Nora Hayes opened the door before they knocked. She'd been watching the road. That's what a person learns after enough years of being cautious. You watch the road. You know who's coming before they arrive. She brought them inside this time. The house was ordered the way a place gets when a person uses order as an argument, as a way of saying, without speaking, that this is a maintained place, a cared-for place, a place that belongs to someone and is treated accordingly. She put a cedar box on the table. Inside, it was her original deed from 1866. 18 years of paid tax receipts in chronological order. Every letter she'd sent to the courts, and every letter she'd received back. The rejections were kept in a separate fold, organized by date. The corners of the box were worn smooth. She'd opened and closed it many times. 18 years of opening it and hoping, and closing it and waiting. Rose picked that up without being told. She looked at those worn corners and understood something she couldn't quite put into words yet. This was what hope looked like when it had nowhere to go. This was what a person did when they refused to stop, but had nowhere to put the refusing. She picked up the most recent rejection from the courts and read part of it aloud. The language about the applicant not meeting standing requirements. The territorial interpretation cited. She set it down. The precedent they cited was overturned by the Federal Circuit in 1879, Rose said. 5 years ago. What they used to deny your petition no longer exists as valid law. You didn't lose this case. This case was never properly heard. Nora looked at her, then at Ethan, then back at Rose. "Can you prove that?" "There's a federal judge in Santa Fe named Eleanor Marsh," Ethan said. "She needs to see your original filing next to the current federal precedent. That's the whole case." "Why would she care about my land?" Rose said. "Because she's one of 2 women serving as federal circuit judges in this country. She knows exactly what it means when a system decides that the law doesn't apply the same way to everyone who walks through the door. If they can deny your rights based on who you are instead of what the law says, they can deny hers the same way. The law protects everyone, or it protects no one. She understands that down to the bone." Nora was quiet for a long moment. She went into the other room. She came back with a folded piece of paper. She set it on the table beside the cedar box. "My husband wrote that before he died," she said. "He told me the record would be corrected one day. He said to be patient and to keep every piece of paper." She looked at both of them. He was right about the papers. She sat down. "Everything I have is in that box," she said. Something needed to be said about what that moment was. Not the legal dimension of it, though that mattered. The weight of it. Nora Hayes knew that if this fight failed, the consequences for her would be different in kind from the consequences for Rose. Not worse in degree, different in kind. She knew that walking in, she'd decided to act anyway. That was the most quietly courageous thing Rose had witnessed in her life so far. On the road back, the horses walked slow in the afternoon light. A comfortable kind of quiet had settled between them, not the absence of conversation. The presence of ease, Rose said, without looking at him. "What was Eleanor like?" "He didn't expect that." "Why?" he said. "Because you carry her with you everywhere. I'd rather know who she was than only know what you lost." He looked at the road, a long pause. Then he started talking, not about the end of it, about the middle, the everyday of it. She hated coffee, he said. But she drank it every morning, because he did, and she didn't want him drinking alone. She named every cow on the ranch, every single one. He'd pretended to find it ridiculous and had secretly known every name by heart. She sang while she worked. She had a voice that was. Honestly, genuinely not good, she sang anyway. Constantly, you still love her, Rose said. It wasn't a question. I always will, he said. But this is the first time I've been able to talk about her without feeling like I'm going under. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She just let him have said it. Let it be true out loud in the afternoon air with nobody rushing past it or trying to fix it. Pain shared in a safe space begins to lose some of the weight of being carried alone. Not all of it. The love doesn't go anywhere, and the grief follows the love wherever it lives. But something about being heard, really heard, without someone trying to resolve it or minimize it or move past it too quickly. Something about that changes how it sits in a person. It doesn't go away. You just learn to carry it different. That's all healing ever really is. Diego found the letters on a Tuesday. He'd been watching the Continental Resources office for 2 weeks, waiting for a window. A moment when the men who usually stood out front were somewhere else. It came mid-morning when Vale's whole crew rode north to look at the Sutter property and left nobody behind. Diego tied his horse 2 blocks over and walked to the office like a man who had business nearby. There was a saddlebag on the hitching post outside that had been there 3 days running. He'd noticed it each time without stopping. On Tuesday, he stopped. The false bottom wasn't sophisticated. It was a piece of leather cut to fit, held by 2 small tacks. Diego had built enough tack rooms to know how things were put together. He had it up in under a minute. 6 letters, Vale's handwriting on the outside, addressed to a VP at Texas and Pacific Railroad. He didn't read them there. He put them inside his shirt and walked back to his horse and rode home at a normal pace. He set them on the kitchen table without a word. Rose picked up the first one. Read it through. Passed it to Ethan. Ethan read it and set it face down. Dollar amounts, he said. Names of officials. Planned survey route adjustments tied to the Callahan transfer. He looked at Diego. This isn't local corruption. This is Federal Railroad fraud. Diego sat down. He'd known what he was looking for. He hadn't known it would be this direct. Vale had written it plainly. The way a man writes when he believes his mail is safe. When he believes the people who might be looking aren't capable of finding what he's hidden. He'd underestimated Diego by the specific amount that powerful men often underestimate the people they consider beneath them. Ethan looked at him across the table. These go directly to Thorne. Nobody local. Beaumont doesn't see these. Diego nodded. He didn't say what he was feeling. He didn't need to. He'd found evidence that could bring down the man who had taken his uncle's land. He'd found it himself. He'd acted on what he knew and come back with something real. He wasn't just loyalty, he was agency. He was the kind of courage that looks ordinary from the outside and is enormous from the inside. Agnes Whitfield had written Elijah Greer one question. No argument, no lecture. Elijah, on the day you die, what do you want to have been able to say about the life you lived? He sat with it one full night. In the morning, he rode out to Callahan's Ridge. He was 56 years old, and he'd been living for 14 months with the specific discomfort of a man who knows the right thing and has been finding reasons not to do it. He'd told himself it was caution. He'd told himself it was complicated. He'd told himself a lot of things that had the shape of wisdom and the weight of cowardice. He sat down at Rose's kitchen table and told them what he'd seen. He'd been present when Vale first explained to Beaumont what cooperation would require. He'd been there when Harold Briggs was recruited. He'd been in the room for conversations he'd had no legitimate reason to attend, except that Vale liked witnesses who had something to lose. Greer had taken notes dated, specific in his own handwriting. He'd kept them folded in a hymnal on his desk for over a year. I've spent 2 years convincing myself I was being careful, he said. But careful, when people around you are being hurt, is just cowardice in a longer coat. I've worn it long enough, Rose said. How long have you had those notes? 14 months. And in those 14 months, she said, Tomas Reyes has been living in 2 rooms. Nora Hayes has been afraid to go to the courthouse. And my father is dead. Greer looked at the table. He didn't argue. He didn't explain. He absorbed it because it was true. And he'd known it was true, and there wasn't anything to say that would make it less true. Then Rose said, But you're here now. Now can't undo what's past. It can only change what comes after. He looked up at her. It wasn't forgiveness. She wasn't offering absolution. She was stating a fact. And the fact was that whatever he'd failed to do before, today he was sitting in this kitchen with his notes on the table, and that was a thing that could be used. He left the notes. He rode back to town. Agnes moved quietly and quickly. She didn't call a meeting. She didn't send letters. She simply knew which women in red and stone saw everything and said nothing. And she visited them one at a time over the course of 2 days. The laundress, the woman who ran the boarding house, the teacher at the schoolhouse, the postmistress. 2 women from the church who had been present at Vale's arrangement with Greer. A woman who cleaned the Continental Resources office twice a week and had been doing so for 8 months. Each one was asked a single thing. Write down one thing you personally saw. A date, a name, a specific event. Nothing general. Nothing secondhand. Just what you yourself witnessed. Small things only if that's what you have. But accurate. Always accurate. Carl Whitfield said at dinner that night that this wasn't Agnes's business and that she was going to bring trouble down on them. Agnes listened to all of it. Then she said, when a woman is about to lose her land because she's standing alone against a corporation that has already bought the sheriff, that is every woman's business in this valley. If they do this to Rose Callahan and nobody says a word, nothing stops them from doing it to any one of us. Our silence isn't safety, Carl. It's an invitation. Carl ate his dinner. Agnes wrote her own account that evening by lamplight and added it to the stack. She caught Ethan at the saloon late that afternoon. She hadn't planned it. She'd come to pass a message to him and found him already there at a corner table. Colt Danner was at the bar with a drink. Agnes left the message and went. Neither man acknowledged the other. Ethan drank his coffee. Danner drank his whiskey. One table between them, no reason for anything else. After a while, Danner spoke to the glass in front of him more than to anyone in particular. Conrad Shaw died last year, he said. Natural causes. Santa Fe. Ethan was quiet. I didn't know, he said. I didn't either, until last month. Danner looked at the glass. Died in bed, doctor present. Everything proper. He turned the glass once in his hand. Never faced a thing. Ethan didn't fill the space. After a moment, he said quietly, so you're wondering what it ever meant to stand on the right side, when the wrong side dies in bed just the same. Danner didn't answer. He drank. They sat for a while longer without talking. Then they went in different directions. Danner didn't change that afternoon. Conversion wasn't what that scene was. He was a man who had stopped believing in anything and was confronting the question of what that had cost him and where it had left him. He wouldn't have an answer until the following afternoon, but the question was in him now. The letter from Clara Beaumont arrived on a Thursday. Sheriff Wade Beaumont signed for it at the window himself and walked back to his office and closed the door. Clara had been writing shorter letters for a year. He deserved that. He'd watched the letters get shorter and known why. This one was short too. One paragraph that mattered. Dad, do you want your grandchildren to know who their grandfather was? Because right now, I don't know what I'd tell them. I don't know who you are anymore, if you want that to change. It has to change while you still have time to change it. I don't know how much time you have left. He read it 3 times. Then he locked his office and sat alone for a long while. A man leaves things to his children. Everyone understands that. Land if he has it. Money if he's made any. The things a person accumulates over a life. But there's another kind of inheritance. The one nobody puts in a will, because it can't be quantified. The record of who a person chose to be when it costs something to choose right. That's what gets passed down whether you intend it to or not. It's what children carry longest. Beaumont sat with that in his locked office until the sun moved off the window. He came alone on a Thursday afternoon. No Danner, no. Hired men. Just Vale on a gray horse at the north gate, with his hat in his hand, a pleasant expression that he'd been practicing for so many years it looked natural on him. Rose came out alone. He made an offer, better than the last one. Land in another county, decent grass, a water source, money enough on top of that to start over properly. He said it all in the same smooth, even voice he used for everything. like he was reading from a list of reasonable things. Rose said no. He put his hat back on, gathered his reins, and then he said, almost as an afterthought, like a man remembering something pleasant. You know, Miss Callahan, I've always had a great deal of respect for stubborn people. Your father was one of the most stubborn men I encountered in this territory. He looked back at her. His voice didn't change at all, right up until he wasn't. He smiled, tipped his hat, rode north. Nothing threatening about it. Nothing you could point to and name. Just a man making an observation. Just a fact set down on the ground between them like a stone. Rose stood in the yard after he was gone. Her hands were at her sides, and they were still. But something had shifted. Something she had been holding back with the discipline of a person who couldn't afford to acknowledge it, had finally shown her its real shape. She was afraid, not of the legal situation, not of the next attack. Afraid the way you get afraid when someone tells you a thing about your father in the past tense. With a smile on his face, and you understand for the first time, really understand, that the person who killed him didn't lose any sleep over it. She went back inside and got to work. That's what there was to do. Ethan had been watching the North Road. He'd seen Vale come and go. He didn't ask what was said. He could read it in how she moved through the kitchen. At midnight, he was still outside. He'd had a feeling about the land office all week. The legal track was building. Vale knew it. A man who couldn't stop the evidence from being gathered might try to destroy the place that held its registration. He was at the back corner of the building when the smell of coal oil hit him. He was around the corner and had the man by the collar before he got the match lit. It was brief, controlled, no shooting. The man was on the ground, and his hands were held behind him before the oil had soaked any further into the wood. When Beaumont arrived, he looked at the man on the ground, looked at Ethan, looked at the building that was standing and not burning. He took out his cuffs. He put them on Vale's man. First time in 2 years, he'd put cuffs on anyone connected to Continental Resources. It was a small thing. He did it like a man setting down a weight he'd been carrying in the wrong hand for too long. Agnes rode hard to the ranch an hour later. 2 of Vale's men were at Nora's place with a document they wanted her to sign before morning. Transfer of property. Sign it, or they'd have more men there by dawn. Ethan had the evidence to preserve at the land office. Rose didn't wait for the conversation. She saddled her horse and went. She came through Nora's gate at a trot and slowed to a walk, crossing the yard. She got down. She walked across the dark yard and stopped between Nora and the 2 men in the doorway. Nora was in the doorframe with the unsigned document in her hand. She hadn't signed it. That was the thing Rose noticed first. 8 months of being pressed and isolated and denied by courts and stood at in the dark by armed men, and she had not signed that paper. Rose looked at the 2 men. "Leave her alone," she said. 2 words, flat and clear. One of them laughed a little. "This ain't your concern, miss. Anyone being threatened in this territory is my concern," Rose said. "You can go now." The second one stepped forward. Rose did not move, not 1 inch. She was 27 years old, and she was standing in the dark between an armed man and a woman she'd known for 4 days, and she was not going to move. That was just the truth of it. There was nothing complicated about it. Ethan came through the gate behind them. He didn't speak. He didn't reach for anything. He simply walked through the gate and stood where they could see him clearly. They recognized him. They ran the numbers. The numbers came out wrong for them. They left. When the sound of their horses faded, Nora lowered the document. She looked at Rose, standing in her yard. "You didn't have to come," Nora said. "You needed someone beside you," Rose said. "That's enough of a reason." Nora looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "My husband used to say people won't help people who look like us. I told him that good people help people who need help. That's a different measure," Ethan said. He was right, and you were right. Both true at the same time, because the world has both kinds of people in it. Nora set the unsigned paper on the porch rail. "I know," she said. They rode home in the dark, Ethan beside her, not a step behind. When Rose's horse caught a rut she hadn't seen, Ethan's hand moved to her reins, not to take them, just to steady. His hand stayed a half second longer than the moment required. She put her hand over his. 1 second. 2. Then they both looked at the road ahead and kept riding. No conversation about it. No naming of it. Just two people who had spent 8 days in the middle of something difficult and had found, somewhere in the middle of all of it, that they were easier in each other's company than they'd been anywhere else in a long time. That was enough for right now. At 3 in the morning, Rose was at the kitchen table. She hadn't planned to be. She'd gone to bed and lay there, in the dark, listening to the quiet, and somewhere around 2 o'clock, she'd understood that she wasn't going to sleep. She came downstairs and sat at the table, and after a while, she opened her father's journal. She didn't read it. She just held it, looked at the handwriting on the first page, the particular slant of his letters, the way he pressed harder on the downstrokes, the handwriting of a man she'd watched write things her entire life. Something ran out. She put her face in her hands and cried, not the way she'd been crying in the days right after. This was different. This was the crying of a person who has been holding something large and composed for too long, and has simply run out of the strength it takes to hold it that way. She cried for her father. For the 5 days she'd spent keeping it managed, because there was too much to do to fall apart properly. For the future she'd imagined that had him in it. For the terrifying possibility that she was not enough. Not as smart or steady or sure as he'd been. Not capable of finishing what he'd built and started, and died in the middle of. Ethan was at the back door. He didn't come in. He sat down on the step outside with his back against the doorframe, close enough that she could hear him settle, far enough that she had her own space. He didn't say it would be all right. He didn't say anything. He just sat there so she'd know someone was there, and she didn't have to perform being fine for anyone's benefit. After a long time, when her breathing had steadied and the worst of it had passed through, she said to the door between them, "I'm not as certain as I act." "I know," he said. "Does it show?" "Only to someone paying attention," he said. She looked at the journal on the table. "Are you going to be all right?" he asked. Eventually she said. "Not tonight," he said. He stayed on the step until the sky started changing colors, until the mockingbird on the fence post started up, until the light came slow and gray over the east ridge, and the ranch came back to itself, piece by piece. He stayed the whole time. The strongest people are not the ones who never break. That's not strength. That's just not having felt enough yet. The strongest ones are the people who can be seen breaking and are not abandoned in the breaking. The ones who come out the other side and find that someone sat on the step the whole time and is still there when they look up. That's what trust is built from, not the easy days, the hard ones. Rose was at the spring before sunrise. The water came up through the limestone the same way it always had, cold and clear, and entirely unconcerned with what was coming. It didn't know about Byron Vale. It didn't know about railroad contracts or forged surveys, or a woman who'd been standing on this land for 9 days, holding it together with both hands. It just ran. She stood at the 2 graves under the cottonwood. The earth on her father's was still raised. It would settle eventually. Everything did, she said it quietly, to the mound and the cottonwood and the early light. "Papa, I don't know if I've done it right, but I've done everything I know how to do." She stood there a minute longer. Then she went back to the house and loaded everything she had. Ethan had received word from Marshal Thorne through the Claxton post office the previous afternoon. Thorne was riding hard. He'd be there by the following morning. Vale knew it too. The man Beaumont had put in a cell the night of the arson had been talking. Vale would move today. She was checking the cellar loophole when she heard Nora's voice from the east garden. What had happened the night before? While Ethan was securing the arson scene and Rose was at Nora's property, was this: Vale had sent a professional, not one of Danner's crew, someone hired specifically for this one job. The assignment was the strongbox under the cellar floor. Get in, get the documents. Get simple enough if nobody's home. He got past the fence. He got to the east side of the house. He didn't get past the garden. Nora Hayes had spent the previous afternoon setting wire snares along the property's east perimeter, the same configurations she'd been setting around her own garden for 12 years. Simple things, low to the ground. designed to stop movement, not to injure. Seriously, she'd been doing it since the second year on her homestead when the foxes figured out her fence line, and she'd had to get smarter than the foxes. The professional went down in the dark and made enough noise that Rose reached him before he got himself free. Nora appeared at the garden's edge in her coat and boots, with a lantern held low. "Fox traps," she said. Rose looked at her. "Foxes in the garden every spring for 12 years," Nora said. "A person learns." She said it matter of fact. Like it was obvious, like there was nothing remarkable about a woman who'd spent 12 years quietly learning her land and had simply applied what she knew to a new problem. That was Nora Hayes. That was exactly who she was. She hadn't needed rescuing. She'd needed a moment where what she already knew how to do was finally useful in a way that mattered. The professional was handed to Beaumont before breakfast. By mid-morning, people were on the road to Callahan's Ridge. Nobody had asked them. They just came. Diego Reyes was first. He'd been there all along. But that morning, he set himself up on the north side of the house with his bandaged arm and his rifle, and the particular expression of a man who has been waiting his whole adult life for a day, exactly like this one. Billy Crane came down the east road on a borrowed horse. He'd left at first light from wherever he'd been sleeping. He didn't wait to be told he was wanted. He'd made his decision somewhere in the night, and he rode in and tied his horse and went up to the east ridge and took a position without a word. His eyes were different than they'd been a week ago, cleaner. Agnes Whitfield arrived with 4 women from Redstone. They came in a wagon. Agnes sat up front with her hands in her lap and her chin level. The other women sat in the bed of it. Not one of them had a gun. They were there because they'd decided that what happened on this property today mattered, and they wanted their presence counted. Agnes got down and walked to where Rose was standing. "We came to witness," Agnes said, "and if witnessing becomes something more than that, we'll be ready for that too." Then Nora Hayes came through the south gate. She walked across the yard quiet as always. She was carrying her late husband's shotgun with both hands, and she stood herself on the porch of the ranch house and looked out at the road. She said to nobody in particular, "He left me the land, and he left me this. He told me to use whichever I needed more." A pause, today I know. And then Beaumont. He came up the north road with 2 deputies behind him. He was wearing his badge in a way he hadn't worn it in years. Not pinned on loose in the morning and forgotten by noon. Worn like it meant something, like it weighed what it should weigh. He positioned himself at the end of the road and didn't say anything. Nobody made a speech. Nobody needed to. There were people on this property, standing in the morning light, who had decided that what happened here was their business, that a woman standing to lose her land and her water and her father's life's work was everyone's business, that the moment when injustice stops being something you watch from a distance is the moment you decide to move your body to where it's happening. They had moved their bodies. That was everything. Rose stood in the road between the gate and the house and looked at all of them. Then she looked at the north road and waited. Vale came at 3 in the afternoon. Colt Danner was on his right, 6 hired men behind them, 8 riders total, the largest force Vale had assembled. He'd decided this would be the last time he needed to assemble one. He stopped at the gate and took in the full picture. Beaumont with 2 deputies, Agnes and 4 women from town, Diego on the north, Billy on the east ridge with a rifle that he was holding like a man who had made up his mind about something, Nora on the porch. For the first time in this entire story, Byron Vale did not speak immediately. Rose stood alone in the road, between the gate and the house. "Not hiding behind a single person, Mr. Vale," she said. Clear, unhurried, like she was starting an ordinary conversation. "Tell me what you came here to do." Out loud, in front of all these people. He looked at her. His pleasant expression was still there, but it had thinned some, stretched tight over something underneath. From the barn door, Ethan stepped out, not in front of Rose, beside her. Off to her, left at an angle where he could see every man and nobody at his back. He didn't block her view. He didn't take her position in the road. He stood next to her because that was where he belonged, and both of them knew it. Danner looked at Ethan. Ethan looked back. Cole, Danner said. Danner. A pause, long enough to choose different today. Danner looked around slowly. Beaumont and his deputies. Billy visible up on the ridge. Thorne arriving in the morning. I don't work for free, Danner said. You're not going to collect on a job that's already done, Ethan said. And I don't think you want to go to federal prison for a man whose name you won't be able to reach from behind bars. Danner didn't answer that. He looked at his saddle horn. Vale gave a single nod, no words, just the nod. One of the 6 riders reached for his gun. Danner did not move. Rose fired first, one shot, into the earth, directly in front of that rider's horse. Placed with the precision of someone who had been learning this land and this rifle since she was old enough to hold one. She could have aimed 3 feet higher. She chose the ground. The horse shied hard and went sideways. The draw went wide. The whole line of riders broke for 3 full seconds. Into the silence that followed, Rose said, flat and clear, no rise in her voice at all. My father taught me to shoot before he taught me to read. He told me this land belongs to the person who knows what she wants. I know what I want. You can all leave now. I won't ask again. Danner reached over and set his gun on his saddle horn, handle outward, pointed away. He looked at the man who had drawn. We're done here, he said. Not a question, not a request. A statement of fact that came from a man who had finally, after a long time of not believing in anything, found something he was not willing to be part of. One man put his gun down, then the next, then all of them. Beaumont rode forward. Vale looked at him. Wade, you know I can make this very difficult for you. I know, Beaumont said. I've known it since the first dollar. He came alongside Vale's horse. Every single day since then, I've known it. And every day I told myself I'd deal with it tomorrow. He reached out and put the cuffs on Vale's wrists. Today's the day. I stop knowing it and start doing something about it. He said it without drama, without satisfaction. Just the plain truth of a man who had waited too long and was finally moving. The right thing is never too late to do, but every day you don't do it has a cost. The cost is in the people who suffer while you wait. Beaumont understood that now in a way he hadn't before Clara's letter. He'd carry it the rest of his life. Carrying it, honestly, was the best thing left he could do. They led Vale away. The yard went quiet. Not a relieved quiet. Not a celebration. The deep quiet of people who have been through something large and need a moment to just breathe on the other side of it. Nora Hayes set the shotgun down on the porch steps. She stepped off the porch and stood beside Agnes. 2 women completely different in every way that the world of 1,884 considered important. Standing next to each other in a ranch yard in Texas because the moment had put them there and neither of them was moving. Billy came down from the ridge. He walked across the yard and stopped in front of Rose. He didn't know what to say. That was written clearly on his face. He'd been on the wrong side of this a week ago, and he knew it, and he didn't know what a person did with that. Rose spoke first. You did what you needed to do. I'm not sure what that was, he said. You chose the right side, she said. At 17, with your father's debt on your shoulders, with everything Vale had over you, you chose the right side. That's more than a lot of grown men manage in a lifetime. Billy looked at the ground. Then he looked up. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Something in his face had settled. The spring ran at the bottom of the slope, same as always. The hawks were working the south flat in the afternoon heat. The land was exactly what it had been that morning and the morning before that. But the people on it were different. That's how change actually works. Not in the land, in the people standing on it. Marshal James Thorne arrived at 7 in the morning with 4 deputies and a warrant and the particular manner of a man who has been waiting 3 years for a specific Tuesday and has finally arrived at it. He was 50 years old, spare and solid, with a gray beard, and the kind of eyes that filed things correctly the first time. He shook Beaumont's hand at the gate. Not warm, not cold. The handshake of a man acknowledging that a correction had been made. He understood what it had cost Beaumont to make it, and he was noting it without making a speech about it. He sat at Rose's kitchen table for 2 hours and read everything. Patrick's journal, Greer's witness notes, Diego's railroad letters, Billy Crane's written testimony, Nora's rejected petition, alongside the current federal precedent that made the rejection invalid. Tomas Reyes's original deed documentation, the accounts that Agnes's network of women had compiled, 8 of them, specific and dated and signed. He put the last page down. 5 independent evidentiary tracks, he said. No attorney in the country can discredit all 5 simultaneously. He looked at Rose. Your father built the foundation of this entire case. Everything else is built on what he started. Rose didn't say anything for a moment. He didn't live to see it hold, she said. No, Thorne said. He didn't, he said it plainly. Without trying to soften it, she appreciated that. He and Ethan went outside, together after. They stood at the fence line, looking at the north road, and didn't say much for a minute. There was something between them that needed to be addressed. Both of them knew it. Thorne spoke first. I owe you an apology, he said. 6 years ago, Conrad Shaw. I knew you were right. I knew the evidence was solid, and I knew what Shaw was doing, and I chose the wrong side anyway. Why? Ethan said. Because I was more afraid of losing my position than I was of doing wrong. Thorne looked at him directly. That is the exact truth of it. I can't make it sound any better than it is. Ethan stood with that for a moment. 6 years ago, I needed to hear that, he said. Right now, I'm finding out it matters less than I thought it would. Less, because what's happening today matters more than what happened 6 years ago, Ethan said. You did right today. You rode a long way to do right today. That's what I need from you. Thorne nodded. He looked at the road. Forgiveness is a strange thing, Ethan said. It doesn't make it stop hurting. What it means is that I'm not going to let the hurt be the reason I stand still. They stood there a while longer. 2 men who had known each other in a different life, standing on the other side of a long time. Then they went back to work. The legal outcomes came in pieces over the following days and weeks, and were relayed by Thorne's office as each piece was confirmed. Vale was charged with land fraud, conspiracy to commit federal railroad corruption, and complicity in the death of Patrick Callahan. The trial lasted 11 days. The jury took 4 hours, 12 years in federal prison. Continental Resources was dissolved by court order within 60 days of the verdict. Callahan's Ridge was confirmed in Rose Callahan's name with no further challenges permissible. Silverthorne Spring was entered into the federal land record as property not subject to dispute. The language was plain and permanent. Tomas Reyes's land was returned with federal compensation for the years of lost use. He stood in his old kitchen for the first time in 4 years and didn't say anything for a long time. He just stood there. Nora Hayes's case was reviewed by Judge Eleanor Marsh of Santa Fe, who issued a 12-page ruling that went through the original petition, the prior court's decision, the federal precedent from 1879, and the applicable statutes one by one. The final paragraph read, "The right to own and hold property is a fundamental human right that does not vary according to the sex, race, or national origin of the holder. The prior ruling of the territorial court in this matter is vacated and reversed. The petitioner's deed stands valid. Her claim to her land is without legal dispute." Rose read that paragraph aloud to Nora at Nora's kitchen table. Nora sat still for a long time after. "My husband waited 14 years for this," she said. "He believed it would come," Rose said. "I know he did." Nora looked at the window. "That's why I kept every piece of paper. Because he believed it, and I believed him." She didn't cry. She just sat with it, let it be real. The other arcs resolved more quietly. Rose offered Billy Crane work at the ranch. He sat with the offer for a while before answering. "After what I did, he started." She stopped him. "You're 17. You were used. A grown man put you in a situation no 17-year-old should be in, and called it a debt. What matters is that you stopped when you could. You didn't hurt anyone. You made a choice when it counted." She looked at him. "That's what people do. That's the whole of it." He said yes. Beaumont was suspended from his position pending a federal review, fined, and his cooperation noted formally in the case record. He didn't fight any of it. He wrote one letter to Thorne confirming every detail of his involvement with full accuracy. Then he wrote to Clara, not a justification, Not a version of events that made him look better than he'd been. Just the plain account. Every decision he'd made, every dollar he'd taken, every time he'd looked the other way. He wrote it all out in his careful handwriting and put it in an envelope and sent it. At the end he wrote, "I don't know if you'll forgive me. I'm not asking you to. I just want you to know the truth. Not the version I'd prefer you to have. You deserve to know who your father actually was. Make of it what you will." He didn't hear back for 6 weeks. When Clara wrote, the letter was short. It said she'd read it 3 times. It said she was still thinking. It said he'd done the right thing by telling the truth, and that she needed time. That was enough. More than he'd expected. More than he deserved. Danner cooperated with Thorne's office in exchange for reduced charges. He provided names and dates and specific operational details that corroborated everything Diego's letters had shown. Then he left Texas and didn't leave a forwarding address. He wasn't redeemed. He wasn't condemned. He was a man who had found his way out of the worst chapter of his life with what he had remaining and had moved on. Greer established a small lending library in the back room of the church, free to anyone who came. No conditions, no membership, no questions about who you were or where you were from. At the opening, which about 30 people attended, he said, "Knowledge shouldn't have a gate on it. That's a lesson I should have applied to everything a long time ago. I can at least apply it now." Harold Briggs cooperated when his name appeared in Patrick's journal and was cross-referenced with 3 of Greer's witness accounts. He lost the promissory note on his building through the federal asset seizure connected to Continental Resources. He kept the building. He kept the store. He was a man who had done wrong out of fear rather than greed, which didn't make it less wrong, but made it more understandable. And Patrick Callahan's journal had said exactly that about him. The damage he'd done was documented honestly. That was the only fairness available. The evening after Thorne left with his deputies and his completed case files, the ranch was quiet for the first time in 3 weeks. Genuinely quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after something large has passed through. Rose and Ethan sat on the back porch. The spring was catching the moonlight below the slope. The air had cooled. Somewhere out on the south flat, a whippoorwill was working. Ethan said, "Thorne offered me reinstatement." Rose looked at him. "Are you going to take it?" "No." "Why not?" He thought about how to say it. "Because there's something I'd rather build than something I'd rather investigate." She looked at the spring for a moment. "Ethan," she said, "I don't need anyone to save this ranch. My father put the foundation down. I'll build on it. That was always going to be true." She turned to look at him. "But I want to ask you something." "Ask. Are you staying because of this land or because of me?" He looked at her steadily, not away, not quickly, just straight. "This is the first place in 6 years that I feel like I'm moving forward instead of standing still." "That's not quite an answer," she said. "Gentle, just honest. Because of you," he said. "You asked me straight, so I'm answering straight." She looked at him for a long moment, then she smiled, not polite, not relieved. The smile of someone who has been quietly wondering about something for longer than she'd admitted and has just received the answer. "My father used to say, land is only as good as the people who love each other on it." He was a wise man, Ethan said. "I know he was." The quiet stretched comfortable between them. Easy. Then Rose, without quite planning it, ran her fingertip along the edge of a small scar on the back of his right hand. An L-shaped thing, old and pale. "Long-heeled horse," he said, almost to himself. "What?" "First one I tried to break. 13 years old. Went down wrong, and the horse came over my hand. Doctor said I was lucky it didn't break the bone." "Were you scared?" she asked. He thought about it. The way he thought about everything. Honestly, without hurrying. "No," he said. "I was thinking about what to do different next time." She looked at the scar. "Ethan." "Rose, my father would have liked you." His jaw moved once. He didn't speak for a moment. A man trying not to show something that was showing anyway. Something that had been locked up a long time and was finding its way to the surface in the plain evening air of a back porch in Texas. He put his other hand over hers. This time it stayed. 2 whole people, not needing each other to be fixed or saved or completed, choosing each other because of who the other person was. That's the only foundation worth building anything on. The only kind of love that doesn't eventually collapse under its own weight. The whippoorwill kept on. The spring kept running. 2 years later, in the fall of 1886, Redstone had 412 people, 70 more than it had before. People came because word traveled. Land here, water here. A school that was actually worth sending your children to. A town that was, slowly, becoming something more than a collection of buildings arranged around a feed mill owned by a man currently serving federal time. The school was Rose's first project after the trial ended. She and Ethan built it the first winter. 1 room on a quarter-acre she donated from the eastern edge of Callahan's Ridge. Diego and Billy worked alongside them. Tomas Reyes came 3 days and wouldn't hear any argument about staying home. Second year, a second room went up. Third year, a third. 38 students by the fall of 1886. Children from every kind of family in the valley. No conditions of enrollment based on background or family name, or where a person's parents had come from, or what color a child's skin was. Rose had written that into the founding charter herself. Witnessed and signed and filed with the county. That had been the hardest fight, not the land office battle. Not Vale's men on the East Ridge. The hardest fight was the town meeting in the spring of 1885, when a man named Gerald Puckett stood up and said he wasn't sure about certain children learning in the same room as certain other children. He said it carefully, the way people say such things when they're trying to sound reasonable about an unreasonable position. Rose looked at him from the front of the room. Mix what exactly, she said. Reading, arithmetic, how to understand a contract before you sign it, how to know your legal rights before someone takes them away. She let that settle for a moment. None of those things belong to one color or one family name or one country of origin. They belong to any person willing to show up and learn. If we turn a child away from a school because of how they look when they walk through the door, we're not running a community institution. We're running a membership club. She looked around the room. I will not run a school like a membership club. Gerald Puckett sat down. Nobody else stood up. Nora Hayes opened her store in the second year. 80 acres of good homestead land, with a cleared space near the road, where she built a small structure, 3 rooms, with a covered porch out front. She grew things the county hadn't seen before. Herbs and produce from varieties she'd brought from her family's garden in Georgia. Things that grew differently here, but grew well when tended right. First year, the customers were mostly curious. Women from town who'd heard about it from Agnes. Second year, it was regulars. Third year, it was a meeting place. People came for the herbs and stayed for the conversation. The way people do when a place feels genuinely welcoming and the person running it treats every customer the same, regardless of who they are. Not everyone was comfortable with Nora. Some people still crossed the street. Some people still looked sideways. She was not fully embraced by everyone, and she understood that might never fully change. But she stood in her own store, on her own land, with her deed in the drawer, and the federal seal on it, and she greeted every person who came through the door with the same plain courtesy, and she ran her business, and she was fine. She told Rose one afternoon, leaning against the porch rail in the late light, I don't need everyone to like me. I need them to respect my right to be here. That's a different thing, and I have that. That's enough. The distinction mattered. Wanting approval and claiming rights were not the same thing. One could be withheld by others. The other couldn't be. Nora Hayes had spent 18 years understanding that difference and building her life around it. Billy Crane turned 19 in the spring of 1886 and was working as deputy under the new sheriff, a man named Joe Delaney who'd been elected 6 months after Beaumont stepped down. Billy was not a hero. He didn't carry himself like one. He was a young man learning, day by day and choice by choice, what it meant to do things right. He showed up to town meetings. He helped people with fence repairs without being asked. He settled disputes in the road calmly. He remembered people's names, small things, consistent things. One afternoon, he found Ethan at the corral and asked him something he'd been carrying for a while. "Do you think I can be a good person?" he said. "After everything I was part of." Ethan looked at him straight. "Billy, I think you're being a good person. Not can be, are. Right now, today," he set down the bridle he was working. "Goodness isn't a place you arrive at. It's not a thing you earn once and then have forever. It's a verb. You do it every day or you don't. You've been doing it." Billy stood with that. "Every day," he said. "Every single one," Ethan said. "And some days it's harder than others. Those are the days that count most." Tomas Reyes had his land back. The first week he spent just walking it, morning to evening. Every fence line and slope and the low corner where the ground went damp in the spring rains. 4 years he'd been away from it, and he wanted to know it again before he did anything else. Diego came out on the second week with his tools, and they started in on the fence line together. It wasn't complicated. Tomas had the land and the knowledge and the years. Diego had the energy and a partnership with Callahan's Ridge that gave them access to equipment. They worked out the arrangement between themselves at a kitchen table over coffee and didn't need any help working it out. Two men who knew what they were doing and trusted each other. Diego was co-manager of Callahan's Ridge on paper, a formal legal partnership, written by Rose and reviewed carefully by both of them, as Patrick Callahan had taught them both to read a contract before they signed one. Diego was not a promoted employee. He was a partner. The paper said so. The law recognized it. That mattered. The paper mattered. Patrick Callahan had believed that the record was the only thing that held when everything else was contested. And he'd been right. And his daughter had built her life on the same principle. And now Diego Reyes had his name on paper that said what was true. It held. On a fall afternoon in 1886, Rose stood at Silverthorne Spring and listened to children's voices from 200 yards east. She could hear them through the schoolroom window. Not the words, just the sound of them. The particular noise that a room full of children working makes, concentrated and alive. She heard the north gate and turned. Ethan was coming down from the north pasture on his horse, the same dun horse, dust on the brim of his hat from the afternoon's work. He rode to the spring and got down without hurrying and stood beside her. He didn't ask what she was thinking. He'd learned that Rose talked when she was ready, and that waiting was not a burden. After a while, she said, "My father built all of this because he believed it was worth building." "He was right," Ethan said. "I built it further because I believe the same thing." She looked at him. "And now there are two people who believe it." He put his hand on her shoulder, not to steer her or guard her, because he was the person who stood beside her, and he wanted that to be felt. He wanted her to feel it plainly, without any question about what it meant. She leaned into it just slightly, just enough to say she felt it. The following week, Rose stood at the front of the classroom with 38 children in it, children of every kind this valley produced, sitting in rows with their books open. She asked them, "What is the law?" They answered the way children answer big questions, honestly, without pretension. Some of them got close. Some of them were far off. All of them were thinking seriously about something serious, and she let them all speak. Then she told them, "The law is what we write down to remind each other that every person has the right to be treated with dignity, the right to own what belongs to them, the right to stand in front of a court and be heard fairly, the right to live wherever they've built their life without having to ask permission from anyone." She looked around the room slowly. Those rights don't come from strength. They don't come from money. They don't come from who your family is, or what you look like, or whether you're a boy or a girl. They belong to every one of you, the same, without exception. She let that be quiet for a moment. And when someone tries to take those rights away from you, or from the person sitting next to you, there is only one answer. You stand up, you say no. Not here. Not today. She looked at them. And you don't stand up alone if you don't have to, because that's why we have each other. A girl in the second row raised her hand. She was 8 years old with a serious face and dark eyes. "Miss Callahan, what if we're too small?" Rose looked at her. "Then you stand next to someone bigger," she said, "and they stand next to you." You keep doing that until you've built something large enough to hold. The bell rang. The children poured out the door into the afternoon, loud and immediate and entirely themselves. The way children are the second they're released into open air. Ethan was at the doorframe. He'd come in from the north pasture early enough to be there. He hadn't told her he was coming. He just was. Rose gathered her papers and looked at him across the empty room. He gave her a small nod, the kind that said everything without saying anything. She turned off the lamp, and they walked out together into the fall afternoon. Silverthorn Spring ran at the bottom of the slope below the cottonwood. The same water that had been running through that limestone crack since long before Patrick Callahan found it in 1861. The same water that had kept everything alive through every drought the territory had produced. The same water that had been worth killing for. Once to a man who was now eating federal meals in a federal cell. It didn't know any of that. It ran clean and cold and entirely itself. It had been doing that long before any of them arrived, and it would keep doing it long after all of them were gone. Under the cottonwood, 2 graves settled evenly into the ground the way graves do over time. Patrick Callahan had believed the record was the only thing that held when everything else fell away. He'd built a record his whole life. He'd died before he saw it used. But it held. That's the thing about building something right. You don't always get to see it hold. Sometimes you build it anyway. Sometimes that's the only thing to do. You build it for the person who comes after you. You build it because it's worth building, even when the building is the last thing you do. You build it and trust the record, and the spring runs on. The characters, settings, and events portrayed in this story are entirely fictional. While certain themes may echo real-life experiences, they are shaped by creative interpretation. The author does not intend to represent or depict any specific individual, organization, or historical event. As the dust finally settles over Silverthorn Spring and the wind moves quietly through Callahan's Ridge, what remains is not just a record of land reclaimed or a battle won, but the deeper truth of what this story was always trying to teach. In a world built on contracts, silence, fear, and power, measured by how many people can be pushed into giving up, the real strength was never in the men who tried to take, but in the people who refused to disappear. Rose Callahan did not begin this journey as a symbol of resistance. She began, as a daughter, holding on to the last words of a father who understood his land better than he understood how dangerous truth could be. And yet, when everything was taken from her, except memory and responsibility, she chose not to surrender what could still be defended: dignity, justice, and the right for a name to remain attached to what it built. This story reminds us that courage is rarely loud. Most of the time, it looks like a woman standing alone at a gate and saying no when it would be easier to say nothing. It looks like a man like Ethan Cole, who carries the weight of past failure but still chooses to step forward again when it matters most. It looks like Diego, like Nora, like Agnes, like all those who were never asked to be part of something larger than themselves, but stepped into it anyway, because silence was no longer acceptable. These are not extraordinary people in the way legends usually define them. They are ordinary people placed in moments that demanded something extraordinary, and they discovered that courage is not something you are born with. It is something you decide to practice when fear is still present. Perhaps the most important lesson of this journey is that justice is never a single moment of triumph. It is a slow accumulation of choices, small refusals to look away, quiet acts of testimony, documents preserved when it would have been easier to burn them, and voices that finally break the long pattern of silence. Evil in this story was never only in one man or one system. It was also in the spaces between people choosing not to speak, not to act, not to risk discomfort. And so the turning point came not when one person became strong enough to fight, but when enough people decided that silence would no longer be their contribution to injustice. And yet, beyond all the conflict, the legal battles, and the confrontations, This story ultimately belongs to something more human than law or revenge. It belongs to memory. Rose did not win because she was the strongest person in the valley. She won because she refused to let her father's work, or the lives of those who suffered before her, be reduced to nothing. Ethan did not find redemption because he erased his past, but because he finally stopped running from it. Nora did not prevail because the world suddenly became fair, but because she persisted long enough for fairness to finally catch up with her. In the end, what carried them all forward was not certainty, but persistence in the absence of it.